Just a week after the September 11th attacks, the September 11th attacks, Alexandra Wright, the first female senior rabbi in the UK, was standing in front of her flock on Rosh Hashanah, and she said these words, and she could have said them today. Perhaps it is enough to say that we are all, to some extent, changed at this Rosh Hashanah. That this tragically unexpected and shattering event has altered us forever. That we have been slowed down in our daily routines. That as we have watched images replaying on the television, read articles and testimonies from bewildered and distraught survivors, we have looked at our own lives in a different light and thought to ourselves, if this can happen just a little way across the water, then it could happen to us. Nothing sharpens the human focus more clearly than the contemplation of our own vulnerability and the transient fragility of our own lives. She could have made that statement today. Many of us spend time trying to figure out what this moment feels like. Pogrom, echoes of historical experiences. For me, it's been 9/11 all the way through. As somebody who was in her 20s in 9/11, my whole worldview was shattered. The idea of the vulnerability of the United States to terror and evil was something that I had not contemplated on the scale that I then had to contemplate. The way that we walked through airports with no security, walking onto a plane, and then a few years later taking off our shoes and our belts and throwing out our water was just one mundane exemplar of how deeply our world had changed and become vulnerable to forces that we preferred not to think about. And so I asked myself, in a changed world, how do we stay resilient? In a changed world that has echoes, certainly from Jewish history and human history, how do we learn from things past that people have done and said and thought and emoted about? And so this morning, what I want to bring to you is I want to bring to you a sermonic legacy. I want to bring you sermons from the last 3 centuries of people dealing with moments where they're facing calamity and they're not sure what to do. And the reason why I want to look at sermons is because what sermons do is they evoke, right? They're evocative. They give you images. The rhetoric raises you and lowers you all at the same time. They invoke Jewish thought and Jewish ideas and the power of our tradition to be able to deal with this moment. And they should provoke. They should provoke us to do something, to think something, to say something, to go somewhere. And so I'm going to look at a legacy that is from around the world, that is from around the Jewish world and geographically around the world. But the way I want to do this is not simply, let me give you a sense of the powerful rhetoric that we've heard over centuries in dealing with difficult moments. What I actually want to do is I want to divide this into 3 parts. The first is I want to look at some sermonizing and preaching that has just been about reacting to the moment that we're in. The power of those reactions, they stay with you, they give you vocabulary, and in some ways they tether you when you feel untethered. They express what's happening inside. The second, and to me the most difficult, agency. Sermons that discuss taking responsibility in a time where we actually feel like the responsibility should be on someone else and that it's someone else's fault that we're here. Don't tell me to take responsibility while I'm being billowed side to side by every wind. And the third, a vision for something beyond this moment, an ability to say we will not be in this forever, and we don't want to be in this forever. Let this not become our new normal. Okay? That's the journey we're going to go on together. Let's start with kind of the mirror that sometimes preaching provides. Now, it's funny, when I talk about sermons, who here gets tired? So here's what I want to tell you. You're mistaken. I sat and read through sermon after sermon that spoke to my heart, that spoke to my intellect. And when I thought about what it meant for a religious leader to get up and stand in the breach and say something, that takes so much courage, and it takes so much fortitude, and it takes so much eloquence. And I was amazed by not just the balm that I found, but the guidance that I found. So I'm going to start with what I would call a contemporary sermon. It's a contemporary sermon written by someone who lives right here, I believe, in Jerusalem. In 2024, she wrote it. Over the last 8 months, I would say I have probably recited more Psalms, more Tehillim than I ever had before. And as Yehuda was talking about yesterday, the two senses of prayer, I mean it in the sense of where human abilities end, God's abilities begin. And so one Psalm, one Tehillah that I keep coming back to is I keep coming back to Psalm 121. Psalm 121, as you have in your booklet, number 2, I can't even read it now just as a description. I'm going to read it now as a prayer. You're all now invited into my personal prayer. Shir lama'alot, esa einai el haharim, me'ayin yavo ezri. A song of ascents. I raise my eyes to the mountains. Where will my help come from? Ezri me'im Adonai oseh shamayim va'aretz. My help comes from God, the maker of heaven and earth. Al yitain lamot raglecha, al yanum shomrecha. God will not let your foot slip. Your guardian will not slumber. Hine lo yanum v'lo yishan shomer Yisrael. Because God doesn't sleep and God doesn't slumber, the guardian of Israel. Adonai shomrecha, Adonai tzilcha yad yaminecha. God guards you, God shades you at your right hand. Yomam hashemesh lo yakeka v'yarech balayla. By day the sun will not strike at you, nor the moon by night. Adonai yishmorcha mikol ra, yishmor et nafshecha. God will guard you from all harm, will guard your life. Adonai yishmor tzeitcha uvoecha me'ata v'ad olam. God will guard your going and coming from now and forever. It is a beautiful assurance, an assurance that you will not falter, that you'll be okay, that you'll be protected, and you'll get through it. And then I read the words, and I'm not going to be able to do this without crying. Then I read the words of Rabbanit Rivka Lubitch, someone who lives in Israel. She is a really important rabbinical pleader in the courts here and part of the Center for Women's Justice. And I read this, and I had to stop reading it. And then I read it again, and I read it out loud, and my husband said, I don't want to hear that. Number 3, she takes Psalm 121, and she inverts it into a protest and a shock and a betrayal. Shir LaNefilot, a song of dissents, not ascents, dissents. Nasati einai el harim. I raised my eyes to the mountains. V'lo ba'ezri, but my help didn't come. Ein li ezer me'im Hashem. I don't have help from God. Oseh shamayim va'aretz, the maker of heaven and earth. Natan lamot raglai. God allowed my legs to falter. Natan lanum shomrai. God allowed my guardians to slumber. Hine nam v'yashan shomer Yisrael. Behold, the guardian of Israel, slept and slumbered. Hashem lo shamar alai, God didn't protect me. Hashem lo hetzel al yad yamini, God didn't shade me on my right hand. Yomam hashemesh hikabi v'yarech balayla, the sun in the day and the moon at night all battered me. Hashem lo shamar alai mikol ra, God didn't protect me from all bad. V'lo shamarat nafshi, did not protect my soul. Ech yishmor Hashem seiti uvo'i me'ata v'ad olam. How is God supposed to protect me? So Yehuda talked about a secular betrayal yesterday of Zionism. There are many people who are feeling a deep, deep religious betrayal. Deep. What is to be of this covenant? What is to be? And so I start with the voice of, I see that something is wrong. The promise that existed is not being fulfilled. And I'm not just going to let that happen. I'm going to protest it. I'm going to turn to Psalm 121 and say, look what's happened to Psalm 121. Is there a way to fix it? Which, of course, is the legacy of Psalms itself. How many Psalms turn to God and say, you've left me. Why have you left me? You're not supposed to leave me. And so when we look at this, we see someone who's expressing isolation. We see someone who's expressing vulnerability. We see someone who is expressing uncertainty, but is not going to be quiet about it. And is not just going to let it be. There are many other ways to respond to this moment. And I want to offer you another from the 17th century. The 17th century, we're looking at Rabbi Saul Levi Mortera. He was in Amsterdam in the 17th century, and he was the leader of Jews who had left Portugal as a result of the Inquisition. And he has this absolutely magnificent sermon where he's also trying to express some sense of emotional relationship to what he sees happening around him, but it's much less absolute. It's much less isolated. It's much less left in the dark. He offers that when you look throughout the Bible, you find 4 different types of weeping. One type of weeping is expressed in number 4 in Esther chapter 8. Vatosef Esther v'tidaber lifnei hamelech. Esther continued and spoke before the king. Vatipol lifnei raglav, and she fell before his feet. Vatev vatitchanen lo, and she cried and she supplicated, she begged. Lahavir et ra'at Haman ha'agagi, to pull back the evil that Haman had decreed, ve'et machshavto asher chashav al Yehudim, and his plans against the Jews. It is a crying of supplication. Please help me. Please assist me. I need you. There's another type of crying, which is distinct, found in places like Job, chapter 30, number 5. A crying of having compassion. Eov is complaining to God, how could you punish me? I'm so good. Im lo vachiti likshe yom agman nafshi le'evion, have I not cried for people who are unfortunate? Have I not grieved for the needy? That is not a crying of supplication. That is a crying of compassion. I see something sad. I see something terrible. And I weep over it. A third type of crying, the crying of pain, one's own pain. Tsa'ar in number 6. Al tivku lamet v'al tanudulo. Don't cry for the dead. Don't lament for the dead. B'chu v'chol laholech. You know who you should weep for? The one who is walking away, who is leaving. Ki lo yashuv od, because they're not going to return v'ra'a et eretz moladato, or see their home. Meaning, for someone who's going through trials and tribulations, it's a crying of pain. And lastly, a crying of joy, but going all the way back to the book of Breshit, of Genesis. When Jacob meets Rachel, Vayishak Yaakov l'Rachel, he kisses her, Vayisa et kolo vayefk, and he raises his voice and he cries, a crying of joy. Let me ask you here, who here over the last 8.5 months has cried tears of supplication, of help? Raise it. Who here has cried tears of compassion? Who here has cried tears of pain? Who here has cried tears of joy? Now, I have to say, one of the most difficult aspects of this time is just how many different types of emotions we feel. Whether it's emotions about different issues or the same moment in time. I cried tears of joy when Noah Argamani was saved. And I cried tears of supplication for the other hostages who are still there. And I cried tears of pain for the soldier who died saving her, and for civilians on the other side who died because of where she was kept and the safety of our soldiers in one and the same moment. But there's something that Mortera does with this that I think is even equally powerful, or offers us something additional. He suggests that his own crying, and this was originally given in the 1640s and then repeated in 1656 because of what you're going to see in number 8. I said that it is indeed true that at present these 4 kinds of weeping were occurring before us, 2 of them primary and 2 of them secondary. We have this weeping ourselves, he says. And then he's going to relate each type of weeping to something else that the Jewish community in Amsterdam is thinking about. The first is the weeping of pain and anguish from the terrible events that have confronted the glorious holy community of Lublin. Cruel enemies have destroyed it, and the weeping is profuse. He describes a group of people living far away from the Jews of Amsterdam. Totally different ethnicity, Jewishly. These are Sephardic Jews talking about Ashkenazic Jews and saying, we weep pain and anguish from their pain and anguish. They have been destroyed. We feel it where we are. The next paragraph. From this is derived the second weeping, that of compassion. As Job said, did I not weep for the hard-pressed? Did I not grieve for the destitute? This applies when you think about the considerable number of notables who yesterday were wealthy, but for whom today fate has set upon an ambush when they were driven out of their domicile of pleasure, out of the land of Brazil. Now we're getting a little closer to home. Sephardic Jews talking about their fellow Sephardic Jews who were driven out from Brazil. How many people here know the story of 23 Jews coming to New Amsterdam in the mid-17th century? Do you know why they came? Because they had to liquidate all their assets and leave Brazil in a matter of 3 months. So we learn it as the beginning of the American Jewish story. And the Portuguese Jews who were sitting in Amsterdam knew exactly what was going on. A little bit closer to home. At the same time, next paragraph, We experience a third weeping of joy. This is because of the great miracle of abundant deliverance by which God has saved us from the plague that prevailed in our city for 6 months. Very personal, local. Yet among all the Jews, no one died except for 2 infants. ... Now, of course, those 2 infants are entire worlds, obviously. But the point is, he goes from the farthest reaches to the most local, and he shows us that you can actually be feeling lots of things for Jews in different places. So how many people here are worried about their own Jewish existence and future in the country and the town where they live? How many people are worried about Israeli Jews? Exactly. Exactly. We can actually have both. The other thing that I see here, you know how people keep saying everything's complex in Israel? So I was talking to somebody yesterday, and I really appreciated her point, and I can't recall who said it, but you know who said it. You know who you are, and thank you. They said that complexity stuff is really not working anymore. And pardon me if one of my colleagues later today says, we have to talk about complexity. At Hartman, we don't have to agree on everything. What Mortera offers us is multiplicity. You can have compassion on civilians on the other side and be in anguish for your own at the same time. You can worry about what's going to happen with anti-Zionism among Jews in America and also worry about the rise of ultranationalism in Israel at the same time. That is the multiplicity of our reality, and you better believe we need those tears of joy in between all of that other weeping. And let's never forget to take them. But this is only part 1. Part 1, let's hold up a mirror. Let's see how we're feeling. Let's see how we react. Is it a sort of absolute, or is it a multiple? But I want to move us to part 2, which I think is much, much, much harder. It is, how do we have agency? How did we take responsibility within and for our reality? Now, you are not going to believe this. You are not going to believe this. You know how sometimes you go and you hear a sermon that's trying not to say anything that's going to annoy anyone? And then other times you hear a sermon or give a sermon where you're specifically trying to annoy people? This is the latter. Rabbi Dr. Walter Wurzburger was himself a German Jew who came to America in 1938. He ended up being very successful as a rabbi in America, and he was also an intellectual. He got his PhD from Harvard, no less, and was also rabbinic, so he's an interesting figure. And he gets up on Yom Kippur in 1943 and says the following: "It is very tempting to wash our hands of all responsibility for the debacle of civilization. After all, what is the individual amidst all these powerful forces? Is he not merely a helpless ship tossed about by the political, social, and economic waves? The truth of the matter, however, is that religion, or I could say Judaism, however you're going to conceive of it, is no opiate at all. It offers no soothing sedative to calm the individual. It offers no protective harbor from a stormy sea. Religion stresses the sacredness and the importance of the human personality. There is no alibi, no excuse for our failures, it says. We are responsible for our deeds." And then he launches into the fact that on Yom Kippur, the high priest would recite 3 confessions, one for himself and his family, one for his fellow priests, and a third for the Jewish people. On this Day of Atonement, he says, this message is brought home to us with extreme clarity and lucidity. When the Jews lived a normal life in Eretz Yisrael, they assembled at this solemn hour, the holiest day of the entire year, at the holiest place in the Temple of Jerusalem. The eyes of the entire people were focused on the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, foremost member of the holiest tribe of the chosen people. Imagine the awe that gripped the people when its most saintly son entered the Holy of Holies to ask forgiveness for the sins of the nation. There, facing his God, stood the high priest to give account for all the failures and shortcomings that undermine the structure of all Jewish existence. Who was to blame for the pettiness and the jealousies which have caused untold suffering to the nation? Upon whose shoulders rested the responsibility for the chaos that put person against person, nation against nation? Was it the militaristic Romans? Was it the idolatrous Babylonians, the godless Assyrians, the faithless Egyptians? Did the high priest blame the internal enemies of Israel? The profiteers, the politicians, the criminals? Nay, this is what he said. Ana Hashem chatati aviti pashati levanecha ani uveiti uvenei Aharon. O Lord, I have sinned, says the high priest. I have failed, I am guilty, responsible for the suffering of human beings. I caused all the agony, misery, and injustice that shakes the structure of our ailing society. Who utters these terrible words? A traitor to the cause of God? A criminal? A social outcast? Nay, it is the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, the chosen representative of the chosen tribe of a chosen people, who represents the best, the highest, the noblest of all Israel. He begins the process with a personal cleansing of repentance. And he goes on. First, the high priest takes responsibility. Then the priestly class takes responsibility. Then the people take responsibility. And this is where he goes with it. In 1943, next paragraph. My friends, how badly have we need of this message today? We are always ready to denounce and blame others. How much time and energy do we waste in condemning the Nazis and the fascists? We witness a conflagration of the world that is unparalleled in history. A civilization goes to pieces, and we see comfort and consolation in the thought that our hands didn't spill this blood. It is not our fault. We pity ourselves. We lament our fate and bemoan our misfortune. How deplorable it is to live in an age that denounces justice, goodness, morality, and decency. We throw our hands up in despair and give up the struggle. We fear that we are merely a pawn in a gigantic chess game. What can we do in the face of all the demonic forces of evil? And then he offers a charge. We are always ready to condemn others. But do we ask ourselves these discomforting questions? Did I send a letter to my congressman to intervene on behalf of those Jews? Did I join a national Jewish organization that strives to save these doomed people? Did I contribute my money to help those that still can be helped? Did I buy war bonds so that this war may be shortened? And let us go one step further. After the process of personal cleansing, let us approach our people. Oh yes, it is a degenerate world, a world that kills the innocent and the weak, that desecrates everything that is holy, a world of master races and slaves. But we in America have also failed miserably. Do we have to travel to Europe in order to discover racial persecution? Why not go to Detroit with its race riots? Couldn't we have stopped Hitler back in 1933? Now he's speaking as a German. Of course we could have, had we not adopted the policy of isolationism and appeasement. And so we behold a world of agony, misery, cruelty, injustice, brutality, and tyranny. We are responsible for it. It is our world. No complaints, no excuses. You think he got fired? He didn't. It's interesting. He has a blend here. And if you continue, I gave you more than we're reading together because this stuff is powerful, in my opinion, and it's worth reading on your own. He has this mix of, what did we do to cause this or not stop it? And what can the individual do now to respond to it? Okay? The latter part is much more comfortable. The latter part is kind of like a pep talk. Individuals can do so much. You can wrangle a group of people. You can talk to the other parents on that board at your school. You can do so much. Amen. You can do so much. But I'm really intrigued by the first part because I'm not part of Hamas. I'm not sure what's my responsibility. So I'm trying to think to myself, what's my responsibility? And I'm curious what other people think. Probably going to talk about it in the Q&A. I have a feeling this is going to raise some. Okay? Here's what I think. And I wrote it down so that I would remember it correctly. Okay? Why did I underestimate the problematics of certain issues on campus and in DEI? And I'm speaking as an American only. Why did I allow polarization to blindfold me to a movement emerging within more liberal environments? Why did Jews in America try to get on teams of right and left in the American polarized world when we know that's never, ever, ever been good for us? And now we're in a crisis. That's just one reflection of my own. And asking, what can I do to not make those mistakes again? And not be lulled into a sense of my own comfort, self-righteousness, opinions. My mom and I are very different politically, and we love talking to each other about it. And I totally dismissed certain things that she pointed out to me over the last 10 years. Just dismissed them. Because I saw the good in the And then my dad says to me on October 8th, I think, he goes, oh, someone like you is probably so crestfallen right now because you're a do-gooder, and I always expected this. And then as time went on, we kept having that conversation. And quite frankly, it brought me back to what Yehuda was talking about last night, which is, how do you actually recognize the mistakes that we made along the way? And again, I'm only talking about my own mistakes, but I think it's worth thinking about. Who do we blame? And where do we not take responsibility where we should and can? This is all under middle of crisis agency. A second middle of crisis agency. This is, I think, the agency that many people are talking about, which is Jewish peoplehood. How do we bring it in a time of crisis? Emma Lazarus, I'm not going to say she's one of my favorite poets. She's one of my favorite Jews, right? I have a lot of favorite poets. She's one of my favorite Jews. Emma Lazarus, before she saw the serious pogroms against Jews in Russia, did whatever she could to avoid talking about her Judaism in public. Really, whatever she could. And then suddenly, in the 1870s and the 1880s, all she can talk about is being a Jew. All she can talk about is Zionism. And she says something that I think is, again, something that we could say in our own day in number 11, in her An Epistle to the Hebrews, which is 15 letters that she wrote to the Jewish press talking about issues of Jewishness at home and abroad. And her goal was actually to tell American Jews, don't feel so privileged where you are and think that you don't need to care about the vulnerability of other Jews. In defiance of the hostile construction that may be put upon my words, number 11, I do not hesitate to say that our national defect is that we are not tribal enough. We have not sufficient solidarity to perceive that when the life and property of a Jew in the uttermost provinces of the Caucasus are attacked, the dignity of a Jew in free America is humiliated. We who are prosperous and independent have not sufficient homogeneity to champion on the ground of a common creed, common stock, a common history, a common heritage of misfortune, the rights of the lowest and poorest Jew peddler who flees for life and liberty of thought from Slavonic mobs. Until we are all free, we are none of us free. But lest we should justify the taunts of our opponents, lest we should become tribal and narrow and Judaic, rather than humane and cosmopolitan, like the anti-Semites of Germany and Jew-baiters of Russia, we ignore and repudiate our unhappy brethren as having no part or share in their misfortunes, until the cup of anguish is held also to our own lips. We have a very, very big problem today, Jews of the West, which is that our very own Jews are worried about being too tribal. I understand the moral concerns of occupation. I understand the moral concerns of civilian deaths. What I do not understand is the ability to turn one's back on 7 million Jews residing in the state of Israel. These are our children. These are our friends. These are our coworkers. These are not strangers. What has emerged is a fear of being too tribal. And I would like to heed Emma Lazarus's words, which is, be more tribal. And what I mean by that is as follows. Number one, being a people is not about politics. It is part of being a Jewish person. It is not about a state. It is not about nationhood. It is about our founding story of being a collective. If that makes people uncomfortable, to me, that is the same as Shabbat making people uncomfortable. We do not throw out Shabbat because it makes someone uncomfortable. We do not throw out our care for fellow Jews because it makes someone uncomfortable. A second tenet, if we are going to actually be a people, we need to recognize all of our people who want to be in that peoplehood. And that means something we have not done for a long time. We have not figured out a way to have proper representation for both liberal/progressive Zionists and conservative Zionists to both have legitimacy within our community. I understand that some institutions can't hold both, but there just needs to be a sea change. If we are a people, we include all the people who want to be part of that people. That is tribal. See how not narrow we want tribal to be? A third tenet, if we are actually going to feel responsible for our people, it means that when our people does something wrong, we try to help. Not point a finger, we try to help. So there are people who try to help in different ways. But one thing that I thought was incredibly powerful was when that World Central Kitchen debacle happened. A group of rabbis got together and created a GoFundMe for World Central Kitchen. That is a great act of peoplehood. They did not spend their time trying to figure out who to blame and who to defend. They said, oh, we're the Jewish people. Okay, let's help. And they did. And they helped. So this call for be more tribal is not a call for be more narrow. It's a call for take our collective Jewish responsibility, future intertwined destiny, empathy, and obligations seriously as we've ever taken it before. not as a way to kick anyone out, but as a way to chart a proper path forward. A third, so far, by the way, just to keep you updated, what we've done is we've looked at some sermonizing that holds up a mirror, that asks, how are we reacting and responding to this moment? So we started with a very absolute, isolated, alienated response. We moved to a much more variegated, multiple response, trying to give voice both to the sort of extremes that we may feel and the multiplicity that we experience. Part 2, which we're in now, thinking about how leaders stand in the breach and offer a path to agency and empowerment in the midst of feeling disempowered. So we start with, are there things we can do now to help? And of course, you're all doing them. Although I will say, I was writing to the Red Cross every day for a very long time, and I stopped. And I'm not saying that writing to the Red Cross is the right move, but I didn't fill it in with something else. So maybe there's a little of that too. But equally important, what did we do to allow some of this stuff to bubble? And how can we change? And I can only say that as an American Jew. I can't speak for an Israeli. And then we move to the opportunity to say Jewish peoplehood must be a value that must be part of our responsibility right now. And the last piece of this that I want to offer today, taking a really heavy responsibility. I know that the war with Hamas is currently contested among Jews, among Israelis, and among Israeli Jews on many grounds. Contested because of the government distrust, contested because we want to bring the hostages home, contested because of what's going on in terms of civilian casualties. I know. I want to bring you back to a month ago or 2 months ago, when probably for most people in this room, it felt less contested. We experienced something very strange. How many people here would say that a key part of their Jewish identity is that Judaism promotes peace and harmony? You can raise it. Oh, wow. Yeah, think back to your pre-October 7th selves, please. Right? How many people? Come on, put them up, put them up. What happens when our Jewish values actually tell us we have to fight? We must fight. Leo Franklin was a rabbi in Detroit during World War I, was looking at the possibility of armistice with Germany and looking at the arguments around it and the conditions that people tried to put on it. And he got up and gave this sermon, number 13. Let us look matters squarely in the face, that we may properly evaluate the spirit of our people. Nothing is as it was. Life has become cheap. Plowshares have been turned into swords and pruning hooks into spears. A reversal of the Isaiah paradigm. Not a reversal that he created, by the way. It's in the book of Joel, the book of Yoel, in number 12. You can look at it later. The whole world is in a state of terror. We have resigned ourselves to the fact that even our children are but instruments in the hand of God, through whose sacrifice we must speed the day of making life worth living in the world. Skip. No, actually, let's do it. And yet, in the face of all these things, our enemies' pleas for peace could not have been without its power to lure the weak and the troubled among us. It would be asking too much of human nature that immediate sorrow should not eagerly grasp at a chance of surcease, and that many a mother's heart torn and bleeding with anxiety for her boy over there should not have read with a thrill of joy the proffer of peace made by our enemies, and reading it hoped it would be accepted. I am not callous to the abounding suffering, and that the mother's heart, full of prayer that her boy may soon return to her from the bloody battlefield, finds no rebuff at my hands. On the other hand, you ready for the on the other hand? This is a person you should know who years earlier said America should not get involved in World War I, who when America got involved in World War I, stood up and said, I don't like it, I don't believe in it, but as an American citizen, I have to support it. And now in 1918, he looks at the possibility of armistice with Germany and he says, hell no. On the other hand, it would be unworthy of a nation that has risen to the supreme heights of patriotism that we have scaled, were it ready at a time like this to sacrifice the whole future of civilization for what would be at best a temporary rest, to be willing to enter into any sort of compromise with a nation degraded as no nation in human history has before been degraded, or indeed to stand ready to negotiate with a brutalized people whose national soul has not been chastened, but that has been brought to its knees merely through considerations of expediency. Make no mistake, the Germans offering an armistice has nothing to do with them no longer wanting to be what they were. It is simply to protect themselves. And then he goes on and says, perhaps, last paragraph on 9, perhaps there are those who, intense in their Americanism and deeply resolved as any that we should not turn from our purposes, are yet surprised that words such as these should be spoken from the pulpit and in the name of religion. Religion, they say, should teach love and forgiveness and forbearance. Religion, they say, should close its eyes to iniquity and by loving persuasion seek to convert the individual or the nation that sins. Such a position, however, will not be taken by those who understand the spirit of Judaism. And then he continues to describe how the Christian church preached a lot of peace as it was killing a lot of people. This, to me, is significant, and it is not pleasant. It is the idea that part of taking responsibility is that sometimes we need to fight, and that turning the other cheek is not going to help anyone. Recognizing evil is a must. It is part of this moment. And we dare not turn around and forget about it. Taking responsibility and agency in the midst of crisis. And our last piece, and then we'll go over it all, don't worry. Maintaining some vision. I was talking to a colleague last night who told me that her husband was in Miluim from, I think she said November to February. She has 3 kids. And then she said he's going to get called up again soon, but I hope it's not before we move, because I need his help moving. What is it that keeps us strong as a people? That is something that in the midst of war, that is likely to get misunderstood. In the midst of war, we think that what keeps us strong as a people is military might, is lobbying, is influence, is money, is connections. Emanuel Jacobowitz wants to remind us that there's actually something much, much, much more core to what keeps Jews and the Jewish future strong. Now, this is just the silliest thing. You know what was the silliest thing? The War of the Falkland Islands. It was so silly. Who here has not heard of the War of the Falkland Islands? Exactly. So silly. Argentina invaded 2 islands that were owned by the British, and the whole thing lasted 74 days. It's a little bit like Argentina. You were a little overmatched here. Why didn't you think about this? But during that war, Emanuel Jacobowitz, who was the chief rabbi of the UK, am I saying that right, Bill Benjamin? Thank you. See, I started with the UK and I ended, you're having a real impact on me. Right? The chief rabbi of the UK decided to give a bunch of lectures related to war and the morality of war. And I think it's really significant that he points to a pasuk, to a verse in Deuteronomy 24, number 15. Ki yikach ish isha chadasha, if someone gets married, lo yetzei batzava, they shouldn't go out to the army. V'lo ya'avor alav l'chol davar, they shouldn't go for any reason. Naki yeleveto shana achat, that person should be exempt for a year. V'simach et ishto asher lakach, and he should build a spousal home of joy, right? So Lord Jacobowitz sees this, and he says, look, I can tell you all the things that you already know. You already know that King David was a mighty warrior and he wasn't allowed to build the temple because he had blood on his hands. We know. The goal is peace. The goal is tranquility. The goal is not war. But he does something more profound, in my opinion. It's at the top of page 12. Let me conclude with some wider reflections on the morality of warfare. I was always fond of telling young couples whose marriage I was due to solemnize of a regulation which sheds a particularly revealing light on the relations between morality and warfare in Jewish thought. Among the biblical rules of conscription, exemption from army service is granted to a betrothed and newlywed man. The express reason given for the exemption is that the newly married man shall be free for his house 1 year, and he shall rejoice with his wife for whom he has taken. By the way, I couldn't help but thinking this, but the verse says that he should be naki, he should be free, but it means clean. And I'm like, what if the verse said he should clean for that first year? Meaning, I have great reverence for the Bible, but I think the double meaning is there. I think it's there. I think it's there. Last line of that first paragraph. To rejoice one's wife, what are you doing this evening? Well, rejoicing one's wife is regarded as a full-time occupation, especially during the first year of marriage. I would say especially during the 17th year of marriage, which often either makes or breaks the marriage. This duty is considered as a national and not just personal obligation. By consolidating your marriage, this law teaches, you perform a greater service to your nation, to the survival of your people, by having a stable home, than by joining the army and defending the people in military battle. The ultimate security of our people lies in our homes. Had we relied merely on military strength and victories, we would have been extinct long ago. Hence, in the choice to be made here between home and army, priority was to be given to the home. There's more to say and there's more to read, but I guarantee you every family member who has someone in the army, in Miluim, would tell you our priority for the future of Jewish life is our home, not this war. This war is a way to keep the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy stable so that we can keep climbing upwards. And I want to move this beyond the home. I want to ask, with all the Jews who are finding themselves in Jewish institutions and Jewish communities for the first time after October 7th, or for the first time in 25 years after October 7th, what are we giving them besides battle cries? We must, for the future of Judaism, not only make this about politics, not only make this about anti-Semitism, we must make this about the deep layers and levels of meaning that being Jewish and being part of a Jewish collective has for us and can have for us. How do we invite people into that conversation? Because that's the long-term conversation. These other things are the short-term conversations for trying to help us get there, but it's not the ultimate goal. I hope that you'll continue to read these sermons, but to be honest, I hope that you'll actually think about the themes, and I want to go through them one more time. When you think about the mirror in which you look, your emotional mirror, where are you now? Are you forsaken? Are you lost? Are you multiple? And if you're one or the other, where are the places where you can communicate that and be that? That's the easy one. Agency. It's not 1943. It's not 1656. It's not 1918. It's not 2001. We must find a way to do, in this moment, what looks so much easier in hindsight, which is to give people agency and responsibility. And the three foci of responsibility and agency that I wanted to bring to the fore today are specifically to ask ourselves, as citizens of where we live, what are the mistakes that we made up to this point that we want to learn from and use to make change in the world? Because there's a sphere of influence that we can't control, but there's a critical sphere of influence that we can and we must control. To what degree do we actually believe that what we do matters? When I engage in a conversation one-on-one, when I engage in organizing people towards a goal, when I engage in lobbying, in some sense, all of those things have power. Do you see the 25 people who stand and just protest for the hostages every day? What difference are they making? All the difference. All the difference. What mistakes have we made up till now, and what can we do now? Not doom scrolling, looking for initiatives, being part of them. The second, Jewish peoplehood. How many people have told me, how many people have felt this since October 7th? They're now the Jew. Wherever you go, you're the Jew. And instead of somebody telling me, asking you, why do Jews light Sabbath candles? They're saying, can you explain to me like the green line and occupation, and also how this war started, and also what's the difference between Palestinian Islamic Jihad and the Palestinian Authority? All of you know. So Emma Lazarus would actually push us to say, yeah, that's your job now. That's your job now. You're the Jew. You want to get away from it? As we said in my house growing up, tough noogies. You can't. And part of being the Jew means we got to educate ourselves. We've got to be willing to say, this is why I think what I think, this is why I believe what I believe, and you may disagree with it. We have to be willing to look at Jewish collectivism and not be embarrassed by it. Well, I'm not Bibi, I'm not the ultra-Orthodox, guess what? You're all of it. You may like it, you may not like it, you're part of it. And the question is, once we're part of it, what are we going to do? So one thing we have to do is make sure that lots of our different streams are shown. Lots of our different streams that want to be part of that collective are able to express themselves and get the support that they need. We need to be able to take responsibility when things go wrong, and not in a manner of saying, look at what that person did. But here's what I'm going to now do in response. We have to be able to treat Jewish peoplehood like any other part of Judaism. Jewish peoplehood is not 19th century nationalism. It's in the Bible. It's the whole thing. It's literally the whole thing. God doesn't say to Abraham, and all of your descendants who happen to pray like this, or all of your people who come to you and like to do tikkun olam, those are your people. No. And thank God we have so many Jews by choice. You know what the rabbis say about Jews by choice? It's like they're reborn, because they want it to be genetic. They don't want it to be conditional. They want it to be Jewish peoplehood. And the third, yes, Judaism tells you have to fight sometime. And yes, even when you're feeling really depleted, really tired, sometimes you still have to fight. The namby-pamby of we can just ignore the things that are not going away and try to push past the present in whatever form that takes, whether it's a two-state solution that doesn't actually have any reform on the Palestinian side, or whether it's an end to a war in a way that I would say the IDF folks who I listen to, which I listen to some IDF folks and not other IDF folks. David, you probably do the same. No, you probably do the same. Okay, I'm on the right team here, right? In a way that's actually not going to destroy the threat that looms. What are we even doing here? What are we even doing here? That's a responsibility. And it's not a responsibility to be embarrassed about. Actually, not accepting that responsibility is something to be embarrassed about. Because I will go back to New York and be all safe and sound and feel great, and everyone will say what a pacifist I am on campus, while my nephew will still be in danger of having to go back into a tank. No good. Not fair. Responsibility. And lastly, my friend Ariel Sari-Levy. Does anybody here know Ariel Sari-Levy? Shoshana, at least raise your hand. You know Ariel Sari-Levy. Ariel Sari-Levy is a fellow at Hartman here in Israel. And Ariel just disappeared from our seminar. We have a North American Israeli seminar. He just disappeared on October 8th. He just stopped coming. And we found out that's because he was fighting. And then he didn't come back for a very long time. And then he came back, and then he had to leave again. And he wrote something on social media the other day, and I'm not going to quote it verbatim, but he wrote something on social media the other day, and he said, "This is not normal. It's not normal. I am a man with a family, and I go somewhere and spend all my waking hours doing nothing I would ever want to be doing in my life, nothing I would ever do with my family, nothing that represents the values that are generally reflected in my usual life." And he said, "I want to make a plea to my fellow soldiers. Please do not accept this as normal. It is not normal. It is not what we aspire to. It is what we have to do. And I want to say to Jews who live in the West, our own battles, let that not become the new normal. Judaism is about anti-Semitism. Judaism is about political lobbying. No, Judaism is about so much more. And we will have nothing to defend if we can't get on track with that. There will be nothing to defend." And so what I hope is that some of what you've heard here did something to invoke some of the things that you've been feeling, some of the things you've been thinking about. I hope that some of it was able to provoke, to actually push us to be a little bit different. And I think some of it, I hope, was just actually able to tell us that even if we haven't been here before, we've been somewhere close. And we've been lots of places that are close. And the responsibility of leaders, and not just your rabbis who are getting up and giving sermons, but everybody in this room, the responsibility of leaders is to stand in the breach. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. I shouldn't do that. Okay, now let's talk for real. Who's got questions and comments? I think this, for people who are new to CLP, I actually think this is where really important work happens. We have 2 people who are walking around. What I want to do is take 2 to 3 questions at a time so that I can kind of weave them, if that's okay. Okay? So I'm not choosing on purpose who's asking. Hi. Oh, and if everybody could just say their name and where they're from, and just talk into the mic loudly, because I'm finding out it's not so easy for everyone to hear.
Hi, I'm Julie Earn from Washington, D.C. Thank you. You articulated a lot of thoughts that have been swirling around my head, and it was really very impressive and helpful to be here this morning. My question is, I was listening to Rachel Goldberg-Poland speak a few days ago, and she focused on the importance of understanding where your enemy is coming from. And in a negotiation, you have to understand the other side. I want to understand your view in how our understanding as a Jewish people of the Palestinian people underpins our agency in what we do going forward. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. All right, we'll take a few more.
Yes, Bill Robbins from White Plains, New York. I suspect I'm probably more conservative than most people here. So the question that I have for you is, as an American Jew to another American Jew, your concept of Jewish peoplehood and the notion of making space in Jewish peoplehood for all views to be heard, liberal Zionists, conservative Zionists. So my question is that a different standard than you would apply to American peoplehood, or do you feel it's equally important within the concept of American peoplehood to make room, for example, for right to lifers, for those who or have belief in, gun rights and so forth? So that's my basic question.
Great. Yeah, let's do one more.
Hi, I'm Eileen Beckman from Newton, Massachusetts. The way he started his question was sort of where I thought he was going to go, but mine was a little different about the broadness of the tent and thinking about those amongst our own people who seem to be placing themselves outside of the tent, whether it's the college students who are siding with the protesters against Israel. And for many of us, I assume that also kind of hits home in terms of where our own family members place themselves and how that all fits in with the tent view.
Great. Super, super, super. Okay, these are great questions. So I actually want to start, let's go in order. Let's talk about Julie's question, right? So how does our understanding of the Palestinian people impact our agency? So the first thing is, what I would say is, when I say evil, I'm talking about Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, right? These are not people, they don't want peace, they don't want a solution, that's not what they're going for, right? They want to sow chaos, they want to murder people, that's what they want to do, okay? Being able to articulate that is like a good start. Now the question of the Palestinian people, I think it's really interesting to ask, what do most Palestinians actually want? And I bet you very few Americans who articulate what they think most Palestinians want have ever read a poll about what Palestinians actually want. So what I would say is, I just want whatever we do to be informed by true understanding of someone else's perspective, rather than assuming that their perspective is my perspective, right? I think that's incredibly important, because if we're talking about 1967 borders, that's different than if we're talking about 1948 borders, right? I want to understand, are most people interested in pre-1948 borders? Are they interested? And also, does it matter what most people think, or does it matter what the leadership thinks? I think your question is spot on, right? It's asking to have a true awareness, a studied awareness, an informed awareness of what people want in order to actually know how to engage. Thank you for that. I truly appreciate it. Okay, Bill, I think American Jews, we have made the biggest mistake since, I don't know, 2008, I guess, right? We've only made one mistake since 2008. Good news, okay? We've made the mistake of falling into the trap of polarization. What do you mean? I can't pray in synagogue with somebody who voted for Donald Trump? My family members voted for Donald Trump. I'm just gonna say it. They did. You wanna know which ones? I'll tell you, you can text them and be like, are you voting for him again? What's your plan? Right? I think it's a huge mistake. Now here's the problem, okay? Bill, here's the problem. And it's the problem with progressive/liberal Zionists and more conservative Zionists also. There are moral questions at play, right? There are moral issues at play. And to ignore moral issues, I mean, look at these sermons that we just read. Each of these sermons should have a disclaimer that says, rabbis don't stay out of politics, right? Because politics are not just politics, there are moral issues. So I think the question is not, can we make space, should we make space, but where can we make space or should we make space? How should we make space and can we make space? I think it's the same for liberal Zionism, or really even more, maybe even more than liberal, maybe progressive Zionism and conservative Zionism. Where are the places, right? So should it be, I'll give like a few options for how you coexist, right? One way that you coexist is nobody says anything. I saw an amazing, as I was doing this research, I saw an amazing like little ad, of course anonymous, in some Jewish American newspaper from the 1870s that basically said, here's a good sermon. A good sermon says things that everybody agrees with, puts a little bit of patriotism in there, makes people feel good, and ends on time. And that was supposed to be a satire, because what the person was saying is, a good sermon is actually supposed to move you to be better. So if somebody thinks being better is limiting gun rights, and somebody else thinks what's better for the country is maintaining gun rights, so one way to deal with it is just don't talk about gun rights. Just don't talk about it, right? Another way to deal with it is multiple people can share their opinions. Let's have a bazaar of opinions. We're gonna have this person who's an NRA lobbyist, and we're gonna have this person who's, right? Imagine this in the Zionist sphere. We're like trying to do this all the time. We have this one person who wants the war to end tomorrow, and this person who wants the war to continue forever, right? So you'll get representation. I have a different idea, and I'm like working with it, okay? I'm serious, I don't know, as it's about to come out of my mouth, I'm like, I need more time. I'm wondering, are there places where a leader is allowed to express their opinion and say, it's okay if you disagree with me? I still think we respect each other. Is that allowed? And what comes to mind is my father-in-law, who's a rabbi in Lawrence, Long Island for 35 years, he wrote a pro-Hillary piece in the Jewish, some Jewish newspaper. And one of his congregants calls him the night before the election, or the night of the election. And this congregant was having like a pro-Trump party in his house, like a watch party. And he calls him and he says, Rabbi, whatever happens tonight, either I'm going to be happy or my rabbi's going to be happy. It's fascinating. I'm not saying it's as simple as that, but one of the things that I think is highly problematic is if people have real perspectives on moral issues, they should be allowed to share them. People should be allowed to disagree with them, and that's okay. That's the point, right? So how do we do that is kind of my question. Okay, placing themselves outside the tent. Okay, we all have the example, you know what I mean? We all have the example. And by the way, the people who are placing themselves outside the tent, they all have the example of us too. I just want you to be very clear about that, okay? Everybody's got their story right now. Here's what I want to say. It is different to represent a voice on your board than it is to say everyone's welcome in synagogue. It is different to have conversations around the Shabbat table or the Passover Seder where everybody is actually allowed to say what they think, and they're allowed to think different things than to say that's now the mission statement of my Hillel. I know I'm not naive. I know it means people are going to leave. Has anybody seen what America, sorry that I'm so America-centric, I just lived there. Has anybody seen what American Jewry looked like before 1935? Most Jews were not Zionists. Okay, so we're gonna have a branch of American Jewry that's not Zionist. Guess what? They're gonna fund their own shuls, they're gonna create their own schools, their own camps. That's gonna happen. Okay, it's happened before. So I think the question is, how does everybody remain menschlich and everybody continue down the path that they think is actually right for Judaism? Right for Judaism. I think it's really important that we kind of accept it as a foregone conclusion instead of trying to fight it and think that you can make the tent wide enough. You make a tent too wide, it falls down. I mean, I'm not an engineer, but you don't need to be an engineer to know that. Okay, that was only 3 questions. Let's go with 3 more. Could we go to this side of the room? Because I know that Elaine had her hand up like first. She shot up, and I want to make sure. So maybe this side.
I was actually curious about your emotional and intellectual response to your father's reaction.
Well, guess what? Dad, come on up. Shoot, he's not here. He's asleep, but that's good because that's just my side. Thank you.
I just said I wasn't going to ask a question, but I do wonder.
Wait, tell us your name. Where
I'm
you
so
from?
sorry. Do I need to? I'll stand.
Whatever you want.
I love attention. My name is Heidi Acock. I live in Chapel Hill. I work in Durham. Come on, North Carolina. Sorry, it's a big group from North Carolina. It's kind of amazing.
Awesome.
So one of the ways that I engage my Jewish soul is by working in social justice groups that are not necessarily Jewish. And I'm missing the March on Washington right now that the Poor People's Campaign is doing. And I wonder how within those movements, which some of us feel like we have been abandoned by, though I don't think we have, how do we engage in that agency that you're talking about within those movements in respectful and effective ways? Thank you.
That's great.
I love your talk. I'm John Dorfman from Newton, Mass.
Could you say that first part again?
Hi, I loved your talk. You're terrific.
Cool, thanks. You got that?
Are we saying do you want it in Spanish?
I'm sending it to my dad.
Okay. Your argument is based on biblical sources, Jewish sources. Our argument as Jews is advanced and helped and buttressed by referring to biblical sources. We live in a secular age. I would bet 99 of 100 North Americans do not have a clue what you're talking about when you speak about beating swords into plowshares. Yet, as Jews, one of the doctrines is you can't have religion in the public square. We don't do that. Jews are weakened when that happens. I wondered if that's something we ought to rethink after 10/7, and I wondered what your response is to the notion that the more religion there is in the public square, the better off we might be in advancing our arguments.
So interesting. Okay, let's start with the lane. See, I told you, this is where the magic happens. Okay, let's start with the lane. So my, when my dad said that, I think it felt half like an I told you so, and half like, I'm sorry, that really stinks. That's really hard. And I think that what Yehuda was talking about last night is sort of like, how do you dust yourself off and recognize that my dad's not totally wrong. He's just not totally right. And I'm not totally wrong, and I'm also not totally right. And I don't mean that in a relativistic way. Like, I actually want to think about where are the places where just sort of a liberal ideology has just led me to ignore certain obvious things. Like, I can't ignore, like, I'll tell you, one of the things when we were doing the Muslim Leadership Initiative, I remember I was always so open with everybody. I would always say, I'm like, listen, we're gonna find ourselves on the other side of a lobbying situation at some point. We're gonna find ourselves on the other side of a protest at some point. We just have to accept that. And after October 7th, I was like, oh my gosh, we find ourselves on the other side of a war. Like, I want a war to continue that is going to kill family members of yours. That is much more serious than I realized. And I don't know how exactly it would have changed the way that I engaged, but that, you know what, let's not think about the extremes. I don't want to do that anymore. I don't want to do that anymore. But that doesn't mean that I'm giving up on coexistence efforts, right? It's just, it's inflected with something new that I think is important. And I think that actually speaks to Heidi's point, which is, right? Because I think that to an extent, we need to try to rebuild where we can. I was amazed. Who was in DC? Is Elisa Agus here? Who was in DC who was talking to us about his social justice efforts at the DC Museum? Do you remember? John, I can't remember, but it was this amazing moment that I just had in DC with Elisa, Diener Agus, sorry about that, where we were talking to somebody who works in social justice in DC, and he said they're starting to have conversations with non-Jewish partner organizations where they're saying, what are the things we could work on and what are the things we can't work on? Let's actually figure out places where we can overlap and should, and then places where we can't and shouldn't. And I think that's such a mature and sober way to do things. And it's kind of what I'm asking for Jews with Jews, right? It's the same kind of thing, just being able to be sober rather than this crazy, you know, I'm going to cancel you and you're going to cancel me. It's not going to be able to be done everywhere. And I also think that someone who's more of a community organizer than I probably has, you know, something smarter to say on this. But I did read and deeply appreciate a piece that was written in the foreword by Dan Smokler, where he said, we Jews have given up on community organizing in the sense of one-on-one conversations with dishwashers, one-on-one conversations with people who get paid minimum wage. And what we've done is we've gone straight to the C-suite and essentially said, how can the C-suite protect me? And what we don't realize is that the C-suite can never protect you from the mass population that thinks ill of you. Like, ultimately, they really, really can't. And I think that's part of this conversation also, right? Being able to engage in conversation that make your stomach ache, that actually, and not everyone can do it. I certainly can't. I certainly wouldn't. But I leave it to you, Heidi, and I'm sure you'll do it. Okay, then John. Dan Smokler. Yeah, it's a great piece. It's a great piece. In my opinion, it's a great piece. Okay, John. Religion in the public square. Look, we're seeing in Israel right now an exemplar of what can go wrong with religion in the public square, right? So, and then you might say that, like, I don't know, the early colonists in America, to some extent, religion in the public square was a force for good. I mean, don't get me wrong, they used Christianity to justify slavery, but maybe you could say the Puritans, I mean, maybe you can say the Quakers who tried to use religion to... So I think I would put it this way. Because I'm kind of a chameleon, I could give this talk without any of the sources that I used, with just the ideas. And I'm not sure what's ultimately better for religion, and I'm not sure what's ultimately better for society. But I guess I would say two things to what you're suggesting. One is, I think that when we say that there's a separation between church and state in America, for example, if you read the language in amicus briefs that are lobbying for things on behalf of religious groups, there is very little separation of church and state in those amicus briefs. I love seeing the Aguda in America and seeing the RAC in America both tell me that their abortion positions are based in Jewish values, and that's why it's important to them, right? One says Jewish law, one says Jewish values. So I don't think that separation is completely real. I think that it's very anemic. I think religion becomes somewhat anemic when it's not allowed into the public square. And at the same time, as a minority, I'm actually a little bit afraid of it in the public square. I'm just gonna be honest, as a minority. As a majority in Israel, even if there's a negative experience, I'm less afraid of it. So I think that would be my answer. All right, we have 6 minutes. Let's see if we can get a few more, maybe from the middle this time.
Elana, thank you very much. We always just are so inspired every time we are with you.
Thank you.
I'm Ruth Golden from Great
I know,
Neck.
it's so nice to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. I'd like to refer to the idea of Jewish peoplehood. We live in Great Neck. At last count, there were 32 synagogues in Great Neck, and there will be more. And there is not a Jewish peoplehood community in Great Neck. What do we do?
You have a Persian community in Great Neck, right?
Yes, we do, yeah.
They are amazing at Jewish peoplehood.
Yes, but they are...
But we and they don't even know that each other exists.
Exactly. So,
Yes.
And even they're members of our synagogue,
Mm-hmm.
but they sit on this side, and the rest of us are on this side. It's so sad. It's so
Sounds
sad.
inspiring.
Yeah.
Okay.
But in addition, there are many Orthodox groups, little ones, and
Those Orthodox, I gotta tell you.
I mean, I am so uncomfortable. When we moved to Great Neck 50 years ago, it wasn't like this.
Right.
So
It's a great question. I'm going to address it. I want to get like one more question, I think, because it's 10:56 and I see my colleagues already leaving to teach their breakout sessions.
Thank you. Israel de la Piedra from Boston, the Temple Emmanuel community.
Hi.
You started with God, and then you gave us a lot of sources, but God fell by the wayside. God is sitting in this room. He needs to know, he or she, I don't know, yeah.
I think just God.
God needs to know what to do. You told us what to do. What would you tell God to do?
Okay. So let's talk about peoplehood. What you're describing is a great problem. We're big. The bigger we get, the less we need each other. That's a great problem, right? You ever go to those campuses where they have like 12 Jews on the campus and they're all best friends, even though anywhere else in the world they would hate each other, right? It's a great problem to have. I think it's a really significant task for Jewish leaders to think about where they can bring different Jews together. Not always, not in every moment, but where? Is it in sort of like civic society issues? Is it in religious issues? Is it in Israel issues? Is it Yom HaShoah, right? But those are things that needs to be thought about on an ongoing basis. And I completely agree with you. I know they're not doing it, but we're trying to help them do it. I can tell you that. Meaning, a lot of people who like to sort of sit on the threshold of different communities, we really try, but we all have to try. Talk to your Jewish leaders, whether they're religious leaders or they're cultural leaders or they're secular leaders. Talk to them and say, when can we make this happen, right? Okay, God. So first of all, I do not tell God what to do. God tells me what to do. God tells me what to do. I could not imagine. I said Tehillim, Psalm 121, to the same God that some mother in Gaza clutching her child, same God is praying. Same God as the evil, wicked people who took those female scouts, stopped and prayed to on video. Same God. God help us all. I do not know. What I do know is I know that I'm not God. And I know that I need God's help. And I have no idea in what form it's going to come. But I am willing to pray for it every day and not exactly even know what comes in response. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Elana.